Imagine a small, rainy island at the edge of the European continent. An island so small you could fit it inside the state of Texas twice. And yet this island built the largest empire in the history of human civilization. At its peak, the British Empire controlled 25% of all the land on Earth and governed 1 in 4 human beings alive at the time. From Stonehenge to Shakespeare, from the Magna Carta to the moon landing, from the slave trade to the suffragettes, from Winston Churchill to Brexit, this is the complete history of the United Kingdom. Welcome to History of Nations, where we tell the complete story of every country on Earth, from its very first breath to the world it lives in today. Today, we begin with one of the most consequential nations in all of human history. A nation of kings and queens, of poets and pirates, of empire builders and freedom fighters. Buckle up, because the story of the United Kingdom is unlike anything you've heard before. Before we dive into the history, let's understand the geography. Because in history, where a nation sits on the map determines almost everything about what happens to it. The United Kingdom is made up of 4 nations: England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Together they occupy the island of Great Britain, plus the northeastern corner of the island of Ireland. Total area? About 243,000 square kilometers. To put that in perspective, that's smaller than the state of Oregon. But here's what makes this island special: its location. Sitting at the crossroads of the Atlantic Ocean and continental Europe, Britain was perfectly positioned to both receive invasions from the continent and launch its own out to the wider world. The English Channel, that narrow 34-kilometer stretch of water between Britain and France, would prove to be one of the most historically significant bodies of water in human history. It protected the island from invasion, and it pushed its people outward onto ships and into the ocean. And the rest, as they say, is history, literally. Our story begins not with kings or castles, but with ice. Around 10,000 years ago, as the last great ice age ended, the land we now call Britain was slowly emerging from beneath glaciers. It was cold, wild, and largely empty. At this point, Britain wasn't even an island. It was still connected to continental Europe by a land bridge, a vast plain that geologists have named Doggerland, stretching from what is now eastern England all the way to Denmark and the Netherlands. People walked across it, animals roamed across it, and slowly humans began to settle on the land that would one day become Britain. Then around 6,500 BC, the sea levels rose, and Britain became an island for the first time. This moment changed everything. The island was now separate, protected, and the people on it were on their own. Over the centuries that followed, Neolithic farmers arrived by boat from Europe, bringing with them a remarkable ambition: the desire to build something permanent. Around 3000 BC, construction began on one of the most mysterious monuments in human history, Stonehenge. To this day, we do not fully understand how prehistoric people, with no metal tools, no wheels, and no written language, managed to transport stones weighing up to 25 tons from Wales, 200 miles away. Whatever its purpose, astronomical calendar, sacred burial ground, ceremonial center, Stonehenge remains one of the greatest engineering achievements of the ancient world. Then came the Celts. From around 600 BC onwards, waves of Celtic-speaking peoples migrated into Britain from Central Europe, bringing with them iron weapons, sophisticated art, and a warrior culture that would define the island for centuries. These were the Britons, fierce, tribal, and fiercely independent. They built great hill forts, they traded with Gaul, they worshipped in sacred groves under the guidance of priests known as Druids. They were the original people of Britain. But their world was about to be shattered by the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever produced. In 55 BC, a Roman general crossed the English Channel with 2 legions of the finest soldiers in the world. His name was Julius Caesar, and Britain had just entered the written record of history for the very first time. Caesar's raids were more reconnaissance than conquest. He withdrew both times. But a century later, in 43 AD, the Emperor Claudius launched a full-scale invasion with 40,000 men. The Celtic tribes, despite fierce resistance, were overwhelmed. Roman Britain, which they called Britannia, had begun. But the Romans quickly discovered that conquering Britain was one thing, keeping it was another. In 60 AD, a queen of the Iceni tribe in eastern Britain rose up against Roman rule with a fury that would go down in legend. Her name was Boudicca. Leading an army estimated at over 100,000 warriors, Boudicca's forces burned 3 Roman cities to the ground, including Londinium, the future city of London. Archaeological evidence has found a thick layer of burnt red ash beneath modern London, dating precisely to this period. The Romans eventually crushed the revolt, but Boudicca's name would live on for 2,000 years as a symbol of resistance against imperial power. Unable to conquer the northern tribes of Caledonia, the people we now call the Scots Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of a wall across the entire width of northern England. Hadrian's Wall, 73 miles long, up to 6 meters high, guarded by 80 forts and 16,000 soldiers, stands today as one of the greatest surviving monuments of the Roman Empire. It was not just a military barrier, it was a statement. Civilization ends here. For nearly 400 years, Britain was Roman. The Romans built roads, many of which still form the basis of British roads today. They built cities. Londinium became London. Eboracum became York. Aquae Sulis became Bath. They introduced Latin, the language that would eventually give birth to English. They brought Christianity. They built an economy. But Rome was dying. By 410 AD, the empire was collapsing under pressure from barbarian invasions across Europe. The last Roman legions were withdrawn from Britain. And just like that, the lights went out. Britain was on its own again. With the Romans gone, Britain entered what historians once called the Dark Ages, though modern scholars prefer the term early medieval period. Into the vacuum left by Rome poured new peoples from across the North Sea. Angles, Saxons, and Jutes Germanic tribes from what is now Denmark and northern Germany began arriving on British shores. They pushed the native Britons westward into Wales, Cornwall, and across the sea to Brittany in France. The Britons were no longer in charge of their own island, and the new arrivals called their new homeland Angleland, England. For the next few centuries, England was a patchwork of competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each fighting the others for dominance: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, and Wessex in the south. It was from Wessex that England's first great hero would emerge. In 871 AD, a young man named Alfred became King of Wessex. He was 22 years old, and his kingdom was on the verge of being swallowed entirely by Viking invaders from Scandinavia. The Vikings, Norse warriors in longships, had spent decades raiding, then settling across northern and eastern England, creating a zone of Danish control known as the Danelaw. Alfred fought 9 battles against the Vikings in his first year as king. He lost most of them. He was reduced to hiding as a fugitive in the marshes of Somerset. There is a legendary story, probably apocryphal, but beloved, that, while hiding in a peasant's cottage, Alfred was so lost in thought planning his next campaign that he allowed the woman's bread to burn. She scolded him, not knowing he was the king. Alfred didn't care. He was already planning his comeback. And what a comeback it was. Alfred reorganized his army, built a navy, the first in English history, and eventually defeated the Viking leader Guthrum at the Battle of Edington in 878 AD. Alfred then did something remarkable. Instead of simply executing Guthrum, he negotiated a treaty, had Guthrum baptized as a Christian, and established a formal boundary between Saxon England and the Danelaw. Alfred the Great, as history would remember him, was not just a warrior. He was a scholar. He translated books into English. He established laws. He built schools. He is the only English monarch in history to be given the title Great. But the Viking threat never truly ended. In 1016, a Danish king named Canute actually became king of England, ruling a vast North Sea empire that included Denmark and Norway. He is famously remembered for sitting on a beach and commanding the tide not to come in, not because he was arrogant and thought he could control the sea, but as a lesson in humility to his flattering courtiers, proving that even a king could not command the forces of nature. By 1042, the English were back in control. Edward the Confessor, mild, pious, and deeply religious, sat on the throne. When he died childless in January 1066, he left behind a question that would change the history of England, and through England, the world forever. Who would be king? 1066 is the most famous date in English history. Almost every British schoolchild knows it, and for good reason. When King Edward died, 3 men claimed the English throne. Harold Godwinson, the powerful English earl who was crowned the very day Edward was buried, Harold Hardrada of Norway, who claimed it by ancient Viking right, and William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed Edward had promised it to him personally. Within 9 months of Edward's death, all 3 men would fight for it, and only one would survive. Harold first marched north and defeated the Norwegian king Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in late September, one of the most decisive victories in English military history. He then immediately turned his exhausted army around and marched 300 miles south because William of Normandy had just landed in the south of England with 7,000 men. On the 14th of October, 1066, at a ridge near the town of Hastings, 2 armies met. The battle lasted all day. Harold's shield wall held for hours, but as evening fell, the Norman cavalry finally broke through. Harold was killed, tradition says, with an arrow through the eye, though historians debate this. William of Normandy was victorious. On Christmas Day, 1066, William, now called the Conqueror, was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. What followed was one of the most total replacements of a ruling class in history. Within 20 years, virtually every Anglo-Saxon lord in England had been replaced by a Norman. French became the language of the court, the church, and the law. English was, temporarily, the language of peasants. Today, roughly a third of all English vocabulary comes from French, almost entirely because of William's conquest. In 1086, William ordered the most comprehensive survey of a medieval kingdom ever conducted. Every village, every field, every pig, every ox in England was recorded. The English called it the Domesday Book because, like the Day of Judgment, there was no appeal from its findings. It remains one of the most extraordinary administrative documents in history. But the most important document of medieval England was still to come. By the early 13th century, English kings had become dangerously powerful and increasingly tyrannical. In 1215, the barons of England had had enough. They forced King John, one of the most despised kings in English history, to meet them at a meadow called Runnymede. There, he was compelled to sign a charter, the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It established, for the very first time in history, that even a king was subject to the law, that no free man could be imprisoned without the judgment of his peers, that justice could not be sold or denied. The Magna Carta did not create democracy, but it planted the seed, and from that seed grew every democratic constitution, every Bill of Rights, every human rights declaration that would follow, including, 575 years later, the American Declaration of Independence. Then came catastrophe. In 1348, a ship arrived in an English port carrying something invisible and absolutely lethal. The Black Death, bubonic plague, swept through England with terrifying speed. Within 2 years, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of England was dead. Villages were abandoned, fields went unplanted. The social order that had held for centuries lords and serfs, masters and peasants, began to crack under the weight of so much death. Ironically, the plague that killed millions also helped create the conditions for the ordinary English people to demand better wages, better rights, and greater freedoms. The world that emerged from the Black Death was ultimately a more equal one. From plague to war, England and France had been fighting on and off for over a century in what history calls the 100 Years' War. At Agincourt in 1415, King Henry V led a vastly outnumbered English army to a stunning victory over the French, a battle immortalized by William Shakespeare. But the tide turned when a teenage peasant girl from the village of Domremy claimed she heard the voice of God commanding her to save France. Her name was Joan of Arc. She inspired a French revival that eventually drove the English entirely out of France, ending the 100 Years' War. England, exhausted and humiliated, then promptly turned on itself. The Wars of the Roses, a dynastic civil war between the House of York and the House of Lancaster, tore the country apart for 30 years. It ended in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field, when a Welsh claimant named Henry Tudor defeated King Richard III, placed the crown on his own head, and began the dynasty that would define the next chapter of English history. The Tudor Age had begun. The Tudors were only 5 monarchs across 118 years, but they changed England and the world beyond recognition. Henry VII, the founder, was cautious and calculating. He stabilized the country after decades of civil war, filled the treasury, and established the dynasty on firm ground. But it was his son who made the Tudors unforgettable. Henry VIII. The name alone conjures an image. A massive, broad-shouldered king in jeweled robes, looking out at the world as if he owned it because, in his mind, he did. Henry wanted an heir. His wife Catherine of Aragon had given him only a daughter. Henry wanted a son, he wanted an annulment. And the Pope said no. Henry's response changed the religious map of the world. He broke England away from the Roman Catholic Church entirely, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, dissolved the monasteries, seizing their vast wealth, and had his marriage annulled by his own archbishop. The English Reformation had begun. Henry married 6 times. 2 of his wives were beheaded. 2 were divorced. 1 died, giving him the son he so desperately wanted, and 1 outlived him. English school children remember their fates with the rhyme, divorced, beheaded. Died, divorced, beheaded, survived. The son he finally got, Edward VI, died at age 15. England then had its first queen regnant, the Catholic Mary I, who burned nearly 300 Protestants at the stake and earned the nickname Bloody Mary. Then came Elizabeth. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, ruled England for 45 years, from 1558 to 1603. She was brilliant, vain, politically masterful, and utterly ruthless when she needed to be. Under Elizabeth, England entered a golden age. Shakespeare wrote his plays. Christopher Marlowe transformed English theater. Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe. In 1588, Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch in the world, sent the Spanish Armada, 130 ships and 30,000 men, to invade England and restore Catholic rule. The English fleet, aided by storms that the English would call the Protestant wind, destroyed the Armada. England was safe, and the message to the world was clear. Britain was a naval power to be reckoned with. Elizabeth never married. She never named an heir. When she died in 1603, she left no child to succeed her. The Tudor line was over. But the kingdom she left behind was one of the most energized, innovative, and ambitious nations in Europe. It was ready more than it knew for what was coming next. When Elizabeth died without an heir, the crown passed to her cousin, King James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. For the first time, England and Scotland were united under one monarch. James believed in the divine right of kings, the idea that a king answered to God alone and not to Parliament. Parliament disagreed, loudly. His son, Charles I, inherited both the throne and the conflict. It ended in the most radical way imaginable. In 1649, King Charles I was put on trial by his own parliament, found guilty of treason against his own people, and publicly executed outside the banqueting house in London. A king of England had been tried, convicted, and beheaded by his own subjects. The world was stunned. Nothing like this had ever happened before in European history. The message was seismic. Kings could be held accountable. England became a republic under the military leader Oliver Cromwell, who proceeded to govern with an iron fist that, in many ways, was more oppressive than the king he had replaced. Cromwell banned Christmas. He banned the theater. He banned dancing. He was, to put it diplomatically, not a great deal of fun. When he died in 1658, the English had had enough. They invited Charles's son back from exile. Charles II, the merry monarch, was restored to the throne in 1660 to scenes of national celebration. But the fundamental question, who held power, the king or parliament, remained unanswered. It was finally resolved, permanently, in 1688. When the Catholic King James II started threatening to overturn Protestant rule, Parliament simply invited his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange to take the throne instead. James fled, William and Mary arrived, and crucially, they signed the Bill of Rights in 1689, a document that formally established parliamentary supremacy over the monarchy. The king could no longer raise taxes without Parliament's approval, could not maintain a standing army in peacetime, could not suspend laws. Britain had, without a revolution in the continental sense, become a constitutional monarchy. Power belonged to Parliament. This was the Glorious Revolution, and its consequences would echo all the way to Philadelphia, 87 years later, when America's founding fathers sat down to write their own Constitution. And now we arrive at the chapter of British history that, more than any other, shaped the world we live in today, the British Empire. At its absolute peak, in the 1920s, the British Empire covered 24% of the Earth's total land surface. It governed 412 million people, roughly 23% of the entire world population at the time. It was, by every measurable standard, the largest empire in the history of human civilization. The phrase used to describe it became famous: the empire on which the sun never sets. And it was literally true at every moment of every day. The sun was shining on British territory somewhere on the globe. But here is the truth that any honest history must tell. The British Empire was built on trade, on industry, on extraordinary naval power, on scientific and legal innovation, and on the genius and courage of explorers, engineers, and administrators from across the world. And it was also built on slavery, on violence, on the theft of land and resources, on the suppression of languages, cultures, and peoples. Both of these things are true, and understanding the empire means holding both truths at the same time. The transatlantic slave trade, in which Britain played the leading role for over a century, forcibly transported an estimated 3.1 million enslaved Africans to the Americas and the Caribbean. They were bought and sold as property. They were worked to death on plantations that generated enormous wealth for Britain. That wealth funded the Industrial Revolution, the banks, the great country houses, the insurance companies, the universities. Much of modern British wealth has its roots, directly or indirectly, in this system. It was a British Member of Parliament, William Wilberforce, who led the campaign to abolish the slave trade, which was finally outlawed in 1807. The abolition of slavery throughout the empire followed in 1833. It was too late for millions, but the principle mattered. Britain had, in law, acknowledged that it was wrong. In India, the British East India Company gradually took control of the subcontinent through a combination of trade, diplomacy, and military conquest. By 1858, after the Great Indian Uprising of 1857, the British Crown took direct control of India. Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India in 1876, And India, with its vast population, its extraordinary resources, its spices, cotton, and textiles, became what the British called the jewel in the crown. In Africa, the scramble began in the 1880s when European powers divided the entire continent between them at the Berlin Conference of 1884 without inviting a single African leader. Britain claimed the lion's share. In Australia and New Zealand, British settlers established colonies that would displace and devastate indigenous populations who had lived on those lands for tens of thousands of years. The British Empire spread the English language, common law, railways, and democratic institutions to every corner of the globe. It also spread disease, famine, particularly in Ireland and India, and the deep psychological wounds of colonialism that nations are still healing today. The empire is gone now, but its legacy, for better and for worse, is everywhere. In the languages we speak, the borders drawn on maps, the institutions of government, the racial inequalities that persist, the cities named after British monarchs, and in the 54 countries of the modern Commonwealth of Nations, former British territories, that chose to maintain a relationship with Britain even after independence, no nation shaped the modern world more than Britain, and no nation carries a more complex legacy. In August 1914, Britain entered the First World War, and nothing would ever be the same again. In 4 years of industrial-scale slaughter, Britain and its empire lost approximately 900,000 men dead. An entire generation of young men from London and Liverpool, from Mumbai and Nairobi, from Sydney and Toronto was consumed by the mud and wire of the Western Front. The names of those battles still carry a weight that is hard to describe. The Somme, Passchendaele, Gallipoli. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the 1st of July, 1916, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties in a single day. It remains the bloodiest day in British military history. Every November, Britain stops. Red poppies are worn. 2 minutes of silence are observed. Because the loss was so great and so defining that it is still over a century later impossible to fully process. 20 years later, the world was at war again, and this time Britain stood alone. By the summer of 1940, Nazi Germany had conquered France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and most of Western Europe. British and Allied forces had been driven to the beaches of Dunkirk, where they were rescued in a desperate, improvised operation involving hundreds of civilian boats and evacuated back to Britain. Britain stood alone against the most powerful military force in Europe. Many expected Britain to surrender. Some in the government advised it, but one man refused. Winston Churchill, appointed Prime Minister in May 1940, stood before Parliament and delivered one of the most famous speeches in the history of the English language. He told his nation, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." Churchill was not promising victory, he was promising defiance, and in that moment defiance was enough. The Royal Air Force fought the Luftwaffe to a standstill in the skies above Britain in what became known as the Battle of Britain. Hitler's invasion plans were abandoned. London was bombed for 57 consecutive nights during the Blitz. But the city held, the people held, and the Cathedral of St. Paul's stood above the smoke and flames, a symbol photographed around the world of British refusal to break. On D-Day, the 6th of June, 1944, Britain, the United States, Canada, and Allied forces launched the largest seaborne invasion in history on the beaches of Normandy. The liberation of Europe had begun. On the 8th of May, 1945, VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, the war in Europe ended. Crowds flooded the streets of London. People wept, embraced strangers, danced. Churchill appeared on a balcony to cheers that could be heard across the city. Britain had survived, battered, bankrupt, and exhausted, but unbroken. Britain had won the war, but it had also lost an empire. In the 1945 general election held just weeks after VE Day, Winston Churchill, the man who had saved the nation, was voted out of power, overwhelmingly. The British people were ready for change. The new Labour government, led by Clement Attlee, launched the most ambitious social program in British history. The National Health Service, the NHS, was founded in 1948, providing free health care to every citizen from birth to death, regardless of their ability to pay. Today, polling consistently shows the NHS to be the institution the British people are most proud of, above the monarchy, above Parliament, above the Empire. In some ways, the NHS is modern Britain's greatest achievement. Meanwhile, the Empire was ending. In 1947, India, the jewel in the crown, gained independence, though the partition that accompanied it caused one of the largest and most traumatic mass migrations in human history. Over the following 2 decades, one by one, British colonies across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean gained their independence. The Union Jack was lowered, new flags were raised, new nations were born. If you want to know which empire was truly more powerful, the British or the Roman, tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this video gave you something new, something you didn't know before then, please subscribe to History of Nations, where next time we'll be traveling 5,000 miles east to tell the story of one of the oldest civilizations in human history. We'll see you there.